Hello, this is Steve Olson, Manager of Training Services for Mesa. In this video, I'd like to take a look at the direct editing function in Inventor and also talk about how we can use that to make a step file into a parametric model. Okay, so here I am in Inventor, and the first step in my process here is going to be to import the step file. So I'm going to go up here to Open. Make sure I'm looking at all files or even specifically step files. I have all files set here for files of type. So I can go right here to this auxpart.step. I've been using this file for quite some time now as a good example of importing a step file and how to use direct edit. So we're going to use this one. I'm going to go ahead and say open. And I get the import dialog box. Once they introduced AnyCAD into an Inventor, we now get an option between referencing the model or converting the model. The reference the model will basically place this as a reference or that step file into here as a reference. Here we're going to convert it. Down here you can see that I've got the types of things I can look for, and it's asking for what Inventor units to use. I'm going to set myself to inches. And everything else here I'm going to leave alone because it's not really what I'm focused on. There's some other options here, but we'll just kind of focus on this. I'll go ahead and say OK, and it's going to bring my model in. So the first thing I want to point out is over here in the browser, you'll see that I have one feature imported. It's a base. This is very common whenever we import a third-party file. It comes in as one lump solid, or what I sometimes will call an unintelligent feature. It's just a solid. There's really no features to it whatsoever. Now, back when I started using Inventor back around 2006, basically if I brought a step file in, I kind of didn't have a whole lot of options of editing what was there. I could put new features on top of that, but for example, if I wanted to move that hole there, I'd have to fill it in and then add a new one on top of it, which was not difficult, but just kind of a pain, and some edits were just very difficult to add. But a few years ago, right about the time they introduced AnyCAD, they introduced this direct edit command. And I want to take a look at that here. So if I go to direct, you can see I have a bunch of different types of edits here. And these are all fairly straightforward. I'm going to use a couple here in this example. But the main point of the example I'm going to show you here is that I can use these tools to make edits to this. But I can also use them in a very specific way, so I can create or convert this model into a parametric design. So you can see here I'm on move. We've got size, scale, rotate, and delete. I'm going to focus on move right now. And you notice that whenever I hover on the model, it's basically looking for a point to be the center of what I'm doing. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of grab the center of this hole right here. And I get some axes that will allow me to move it. So I'm going to go ahead and slide this out into space. I'm just going to kind of just go a certain distance. I don't really have a desired number right now. One thing I want to change though is this measure from. You can see right now it's doing an offset of 0.438. But let's say I want to specify the entire length of this component. So I can say measure from, come over here, hit this face, and now I get a value that is that length. And let's just put 2.5 for right now. So if I stop this, and I look at my parameters, you'll notice that I get a D2. That value I entered is basically that distance. So I'm going to go ahead and change this to length. So now I have a parameter that drives that length. Let me just kind of throw a couple more on here, and then we'll kind of take a look at what we've got, because there's a special thing we need to do here as well. Let's say we want to change the diameter of this hole. So I'll go back to direct. I'll grab this face here. I'm going to have to go to size in this case. And if I start moving it, you can see it's giving me an offset value. But if I go to this option right here, I can specify the diameter or the radius. Let's go to diameter. And this time I'll type hole DIA equals, we'll go with a 1/2 inch. So if I close this, let's look at our parameters now. So in this case, by typing hole DIA equals 0.5, it changed the name of the parameter for me automatically, which is really nice and really helpful. So I've got two features somewhat parametric, and actually what I'm going to do here is I can even change the names of these features. I can call this length. And I can call this whole DIA. Now I could do that repeatedly to get all these features tied in, but I think you've seen the process here, so I want to show you something else. One thing I discovered is if I change the parameter back to the original value, you'll see I get an error because it doesn't see that that feature does anything. So I have two ways of solving that. I'm actually going to show you probably the easier way to solve this. So we could do it with iLogic, or we could do it with properties of the feature. So if you go to this length parameter here, this length direct edit feature, I right click on this and I say properties. You see length, and then I have suppress always or if. So if I check if, I can then specify a parameter and a value or a greater than or less than value that it will suppress it. So let's say I go to length. If I say length is equal to 2, which was the original value of this or that dimension, that will solve that. So I'll go ahead and say OK. So now you can see I'm at 2. Over here in my browser, it suppresses that length. If I go to 2.5, you can see behind me the part, or behind this box, that feature, that object changed length, and that feature is now enabled. If I go down to like 1.5, it shrinks the part and that feature stays enabled. If I go back to 2, it suppresses it and kind of goes back to the original size. So let me just do that one more time with this whole DIA. So if I go here and go edit feature, I'm sorry, not edit feature, I'm going to go to properties. I can say if whole DIA, and the original value of that was 0.5 or 0.75. So original value, say OK. So now just to prove that to you, if I go here, my whole DIA, if I set that to 0.75, you see the whole changes size. It suppresses that feature. If I go to say 0.875, the whole changes size, and that feature is still enabled. And here, just to change the length of that. So realistically, the process here is really the same. You create a feature that will control, or a direct edit feature that controls that distance, turn it into a parameter, and then you just have to be aware that you'll have to change the value or the properties of that feature to suppress if it goes back to the original value. I'll do one more here just so you can see the process, because the whole here threw me for a loop initially, changing the distance or the direction. So if I go to move, pick this whole, I'm going to kind of just grab it and move it a little bit this way. I can now use measure from. I can come over here, and let's say it's going to be a 1/2 inch. And I can even use something like hdist equals 1/2 inch. And I'll go ahead and close this. So now if I go to this feature, go to my properties, I can say if hdistance equals, I believe it was 3.75 initially. So now let's test this out. If I go and change my hdistance to 0.75, that gets suppressed and we're good. So that's working out pretty good. Now, one thing I will point out is when you do that suppress if, you see we get additional parameters here to control those. So you might say, well, I'm worried I'm going to end up picking the wrong thing. Well, if we go over here to iLogic, we can actually create a form. Right click, say add form, where I can grab and add these parameters to a dialog box so I don't have to kind of weed through additional parameters. I could do something also with a key parameter, but for our case here, I'm just going to add them to a form. I'll call these parameters. So now if I click on this, you can see I've got good control. If I go back to my model browser here, just so you can see 3, that's working. Go back to 2, that's working the way I wanted. Whole DIA, let's go to 0.625. That's looking pretty good. If I change my whole my h distance to, let's say, 1, everything is behaving the way that we expected it to. I've covered a lot of ground in this video, so I just want to take a brief second and kind of review what I talked about. So we can import step files, and just using the open, tell it to open a step file, and then we can choose import. And once we have that, we just have a base feature, but we can use our direct edit commands up here to be able to edit that. And I only covered the move and the size, but these tools are fairly simple to understand. So if you like those, you can go ahead and explore those a little bit more. We also looked at how when I create these, it creates parameters about the distance. And one of my favorite things to do is this measure from, or when I do a hole, I can change this to diameter. If I was doing a fillet, I could do a radius. You can see I can also do a scale, rotate, or delete, which would allow me to delete this face. But once we get those parameters, we can then make those something that we use to drive our model and basically get a parametric model at that point. The one thing that I also kind of found out is if we basically drive the model back to its original size, the feature kind of errors. And that's where I used if I came over to a feature, I could right click and go to properties and then say, well, suppress if a specific parameter value equals the original value of that step file. So there is a way to do it through iLogic, but I figured this is really easy. It's not as complicated. iLogic, you kind of do a little bit of programming, like if-then statements, and that gets a little intimidating to folks that aren't really comfortable with programming. But you can see here, this is pretty straightforward. It's just suppress if, you pick a parameter value, you pick a condition. We've got equal, not equal, etc. And then at that point, it's going to follow that. And if you decide, hey, that was not what I want, you just basically, oops, I suppressed the feature. If you say, hey, I don't want that, you come back and just uncheck the if, and it goes back to being the way it was before. So you don't have any conditional suppressions. I hope you found this video informative and helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at my email address there on the screen. And as always, thanks for watching.